Welcome back to the second half of the first day, and we have Ron Mallon speaking on Metaphysics, Method, and Politics: The Case of Race. Ron.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. Let's see. So what I want to start with is, let's see. I've always been most interested in that part of social ontology that tries to understand putatively natural things as socially caused or constituted or grounded. And today I want to focus on debates over the existence and character of race as a kind of case study for considering methodological questions about what might be useful ways of resolving them. Before I go on though, can I ask, can you see my slide that I've shared? Great. So there are a couple of questions here. One is a kind of metaphysical question: what's race? Does it even exist? If it does exist, what is the character of race or the features of race? And then there's a kind of practice question: how should we use racial concepts or terms, what I call race talk, in our thoughts and practices to divide ourselves and others for our various theoretical and practical ends? Should we use them or avoid them in social science and public policy or in our social lives? So I'm going to start just by giving some answers to the metaphysical questions from the literature. People who have been following this literature, this will be pretty familiar. There's a kind of, the legacy view is widely viewed as something we might call racialism or racial essentialism, holds that races are real and that the reality of race is underwritten by a rich cluster of natural intrinsic properties that are shared by members of a race. These intrinsic properties explain many race-typical features, including both physical and bodily traits that we take to be indicative of racial membership, as well as other moral, intellectual, and aesthetic properties of individuals and of racial groups. And these properties are passed on from parents to children. Now, a lot of people have held this view historically. It's now what I think of as a kind of failing research program, but of course it's still represented by some people. Watson, the famous biologist, a few years seemed to have come out in favor of it, but it's largely viewed as in retreat, and it's viewed as in retreat in part because the biology doesn't seem to have really supported the rich claims of the racialist view. So a common response to this is a kind of skeptical anti-realism. They tend to hold that races are not real, like phlogiston or witches or fairies. They're posits of a false pre-scientific way of conceiving the world that we now know to be false. As I said, there are many arguments, but a key one is that there just are not racial essences of the sort that the view imagined. And people like Anthony Appian, Naomi Zak, and Lawrence Bloom, and Adam Hochman, and Franz Boas, Josh Glasgow have all held this view. Another view is that races are biological populations of some sort. They're real, they are or they were populations of humans produced by partial reproductive isolation in ancestral environments. Racial membership is not especially explanatory according to most of these people, except for the set of traits that amount to adaptations to these specific ancestral environmental conditions. For example, lighter skin is an adaptation to northerly climates and darker skin to equatorial climates. People like Philip Kitcher, Quayshawn Spencer, and Robin Andreasen have held this view. Finally, maybe the most popular view nowadays, both within philosophy and outside of it, is that race is some kind of social construction. This view is that races are real, they're produced by our social practices and perhaps attached to thin natural features, ascribed on the basis of those features. But the idea is that racial membership might explain a rich set of other properties in a social environment, but this is a causal or constitutive consequence of our social practices. And lots of people hold this: Lawrence Outlaw, Adrian Piper, Robert Gooding Williams, G.K. Jeffers, Sally Haslanger, Asta Omi and Winant, Charles Mills, and so on. Very recently, people have started flirting with an idea you could call thin realism. The idea is that races are real, at least in the sense of real that they're objective. They're characterized, there's an objective fact about who belongs to which race, but they're characterized by a thin set of properties that are not very explanatory of other properties independent of our social practices. Josh Glasgow has also defended this view. I think Charles Mills sometimes seems to defend it. Michael Hardiman defends it. Okay, so now I want to get into my the second section here, and I want to claim that the debate over the metaphysics of race is really just a verbal dispute. So I think there's a broad consensus among philosophers, at least, on most of the basic facts surrounding racial phenomena, so long as we don't use racial terms or concepts. So that there's kind of argument that there's a verbal dispute here using something like the neutral vocabulary test, when you can cast a dispute by changing the words or concepts in terms that everyone agrees with, then that's indicative of the dispute being a verbal dispute, unless it's one of a special maybe group of what David Chalmers calls bedrock concepts or something. And I don't think this is a candidate for that. So a number of people, including me and some earlier work, have pointed out that it seems like that really there's a verbal dispute going on here. David Lubig, Olivier Lemaire, Lisa Gannett, among others. So just to give a sense of that ontological consensus, that broad consensus, people tend to agree there's a common disposition to believe in racialism, at least in European and American cultures, to essentialize racial categories, to treat racial membership as grounded in possession of intrinsic unseen essences, that racial essentialism is false, that nonetheless there are some genetic differences that are correlated with race, which is why you can use services like 23andMe and find out things about the locations of your ancestral populations. Ordinary racial classifications are highly correlated with the geographic origins of one's ancestors in many cases in the US. People also ascribe races to themselves and others. Some people feel really strongly about the importance of their own racial identity. Some communities organize around race. There's a history of using racial categorizations to divide people, to rationalize colonialism and oppression, to rationalize violence and prejudice, to justify policies against miscegenation. This oppression, though in many ways much worse in the past, has lingering effects that are still with us today, like structural inequalities. And there are cultural items that are differentially associated with different races. There are specific racial cultures that emerge as a result of differential sharing of experiences and cultural items among members of different races. Now, there are a few limits to this consensus. There are, of course, racialism holdouts, people who still hold racialism as true, as I mentioned earlier. And there are lots of like specific empirical questions, like or theoretical questions, like when we're grouping humans phylogenetically, are these natural kinds, or are they sort of convenient representational devices? In what sense do racial groups share cultures? What does this mean exactly, given that, of course, culture gets shared widely between members of races? Do some members of racial groups carry trauma in the form of epigenetic harms? Are there implicit biases or microaggressions that are really a significant source of contemporary racial advantage? Or are they primarily swamped by structural sources of disadvantage, and so on? So even though there are there are these various empirical issues that continue to be debated, these issues are really peripheral to most debates over the metaphysics of race, and primarily the differences among the metaphysicians of race aren't traceable to these specific empirical questions. So when we go back to this neutral vocabulary test, I'm going to suggest that the neutral vocabulary test is met, and that we can cast disputes about race in neutral vocabularies, and people will agree to it. So this is a kind of test for you. If you're hearing someone give a paper about the metaphysics of race, you might ask them to state their argument without using racial terms or concepts to see if a verbal dispute is at issue. Okay, So I think that this is a verbal dispute is often recognized even by those who pursue metaphysical views. For example, Chike Jeffers wrote in this recent collection of metaphysical views, we should not exaggerate how different anti-realism, social constructionism, and non-essentialist biological realism are when they're all united in denying the existence of biological essences traditionally ascribed to races, and it remains unclear how much they diverge with regard to those entities or relations whose existences they positively affirm. Or David Livingston Smith said, although skeptics and constructionists are fundamentally at odds about the concept of race, this shouldn't obscure the fact that they also share a lot of ground. They both agree that racial classification is a real and powerful force and hold that racial categories don't drop out of the blue, but are ideological constructions. So in fact, I think there's this broad consensus, and not only is there a broad consensus about the facts about race, I think actually there's a relatively broad consensus that there exists a broad consensus. So if we have a verbal dispute, here are a couple of methods for resolving a verbal dispute, which I take it figured in this literature and in my own work. One you could call the semantic strategy, which is if we want to know what race is, we ought to figure out what racial terms and concepts mean. Of course, there are a priori strategies. We can do conceptual analysis. We can try to write out a Ramsey sentence. There are a posteriori strategies. We can empirically investigate the world and find out, as it were, what race must be once we've discovered its character or essence in the world. And then, of course, there's a kind of engineering strategy where we try to figure out what racial terms or concepts should mean, given our current situation. There are ameliorative projects and conceptual engineering projects and conceptual ethics projects. And so I want us to consider this semantic method first and just point out a kind of shortcoming to it that I haven't really discussed before. In the past, I've been kind of critical about the possibility of semantic disputes, but some philosophers accept that debates over the reality of race are semantic disputes, and they're to be addressed and hopefully solved by careful elucidation of our shared racial concepts. And so this sort of links our practices of race talk with metaphysical facts using theories about what race talk really means. So for example, eliminativists or skeptics are inclined to argue that because race means something with the racial essences, races don't exist. Others say because race means a group of people with shared ancestry, races are thin biological kinds, for example. Now, semantics is a nice method because, and which is why it's been so influential in philosophy, I think. It promises to provide some kind of bridge that connects this first metaphysical question, what is race, with this normative question, how ought we to use race talk? And the thought is we should use race talk in a way that picks out the facts about race. And so for this reason, I think racial realists have tended to be conservationists about race talk. That is, if you think race is real, it gives you a reason to want to keep using race talk to pick out those real features of the world. Racial skeptics have tended to be eliminativists about race talk. If you think race isn't real, it gives you a reason to not want to use race talk. Using semantics in this way, I think, has been a core strategy of philosophers in a lot of areas for some time. I previously argued that I don't think we ought to make debates over what to do with race talk beholden to semantic disputes that may have no resolution. And even if there were a semantically correct answer, the range of considerations at play in debates over race talk plausibly overrides semantically correct answers. So just thinking about that first question, I was thinking on the one hand, on the basis of experimental philosophy work, that it seems like intuitions about the cases that drive different semantic theories seem to vary within and between cultures. And the references of racial terms may even be ambiguous between non-rigid and rigid reference. That is, we can all sort of make sense and switch back and forth between various kinds of theories of reference, depending upon our cues and our primes and the context that we're in. Resolving the dispute also seems to depend on our ability to successfully draw an analytic synthetic distinction. So a skeptic who argues that race essentially involves a commitment to racial essences argues that there are no race essences and so race doesn't exist. But the realist might argue that a race is associated with the belief in racial essences, but a commitment to racial essences is not criterion for the concept. So races do, or at least could, exist. And resolving this debate semantically means discovering which facts are analytic features of race concepts. Now, you might think that this is all sort of too quick to imagine the these virtues of truth and meaning. On the one hand, you might think it's too pessimistic. Not everyone agrees analytic conceptual truths and word meanings are hard to come by or difficult to discern. And if so, then at least some questions, like whether race concept necessarily involves a commitment to essentialism, would seem like good candidates. On the other hand, you might think it's kind of cynical, because when we separate the project of what we ought to do with race talk from the project about what race really is, we are sort of abandoning or overriding questions about semantics and truth to some. So that might seem kind of cynical. For example, Adam Hochman writes that to talk about race as if it were real on ethical grounds while believing that it is not real, or vice versa, is an invitation to one's political opponents to cry political correctness. So I wanted to just give a new argument here today, though. What if we approach the question sort of semantics and truth first? Let's suppose, as it were, pace the worries that I just raised, that there is a semantic matter of the fact and we can discover it. And also suppose that we're philosophers and we prize truth among other possible theoretical virtues. Those are easy suppositions. So eliminativist about race focus up on the harm that race talk does. So we think about eliminativists like Appia. He said the truth is there are no races. There's nothing in the world that we can do. Udell and others say, we believe the use of biological concept of race in genetic research, so disputed and mired in confusion, is problematic and best and harmful at work. So you have this mixture of claims about falsity and also commonly claims about harm. So metaphysicians of race often talk as if their opponents are mired in conceptual or empirical solution, and what confusion. And what I want to argue is that even given the assumption of a semantically correct answer, a concern with truth still requires kind of constant bookkeeping of misunderstandings. So it would be a mistake, I think, to overstate the advantages of getting the semantic facts right, even if there is a getting it right. So if we agree that the skeptics have it right, that race talk means something essentialist and that essences don't exist, then the skeptic wants to say things like race doesn't exist. And the skeptic wants to urge everyone to avoid saying things, as it were, the skeptic eliminativist anyway, the one who wants to eliminate race talk, wants to avoid saying things like race exists, or Benjamin is black, or William is white. Black people are underrepresented in the philosophy profession relative to the proportion of Black people in the populations that philosophy draws from and serve. Black voters overwhelmingly supported Biden in the 2020 election, and so on. But we're supposed to not use these kinds of racial terms and concepts. Conservationists, though, worry if that we were all to come to talk in this eliminativist way, if we were all to come to accept that race doesn't exist, we would tend to infer things like white privilege is not real, race-based oppression is not real, race-based social equity programs are unjust, racial identity is an illusion, there's no underrepresentation in philosophy, and so on. So the conservationists worry specifically that the skeptical eliminativist talk, even if it's true, leads people to draw misleading and false implications. Now, by implication here, I don't mean entailment. I rather mean something like a tendency to move between the states or to think something follows from something else, as in pragmatic implicature. So when we're concerned with the truth of an utterance, we're concerned with what it communicates, and that can be its literal meaning, its semantic meaning. But the concern of truth extends not only to the literal meaning, but also to the meaning of the various kinds of inferences and implications that we might draw from various claims, like the claim that race doesn't exist. I want to suggest then that a concern with truth demands that we weigh the costs of certain patterns of speech over others for the overall propositions that they communicate. Now, of course, the skeptical eliminativist has answers to all these false inferences, because not only do they say race doesn't exist, but they typically say things while race is not real, there's been oppression on the basis of racial classification. Or while race is not real, racial identities in which people organize themselves symbolically into racial categories are real. Or they might propose systematic linguistic remedies, like talking about racial classification or racialization in place of race talk. Or they might speak of restricting the use of generics, for example, as Sarah Jane Leslie has. Now that this is possible, that this kind of assertion and canceling is possible without a lot of debate is just a consequence of what I noted earlier, which is that skeptic and realists about race share a broad range of metaphysical agreement about what the facts are. Anything the realist conservationist says in some words about the importance of racial identities, for example, the skeptic can say in other words. And the converse is also true. Even if realist race talk is literally true, eliminativists worry that it leads people to misleading and false inferences about the existence of racial essences and the legitimacy of racial generalizations. That's part of the argument for eliminating race, is that it leads people to false, misleading inferences. And realist conservationists respond by denying those inferences. They say race is real, but racial essences aren't real. Racial generalizations aren't justified, or at least they're not grounded in natural facts. So if semantic facts led us to stop using race talk, as the eliminativists might like, we nonetheless end up with a bunch of false implicatures emphasized by the realist conservationists that the skeptic then implicitly cancels. And if they demand that we keep race talk, we end up with a set of false implications emphasized by the skeptical eliminativists that the conservationist then explicitly cancels. The result is a bit like a case of theory choice between empirically equivalent theories. So what I want to sort of conclude about this kind of semantic strategy is that when we talk about race or decline to do so, there's no simple words or phrases that can be used that do not facilitate misunderstandings and mistakes. And the result is that in order to avoid being misleading in any way, we have to say a lot, not just whether race exists or not, but we have to talk about canceling implicatures and what people might take various claims to mean. Even if we could get the semantic facts right, then it doesn't eliminate the need for lots of implicature bookkeeping. Since I take it that one of the main reasons for a kind of advocacy of practice, for example, for eliminativism, is to thwart false implicatures, this seems like a significant conclusion, a kind of pessimistic conclusion about what we could get out of the semantic strategy. Okay, I want to talk about another method now that's, of course, in vogue these days, which is kind of the idea of engineering or conceptual amelioration. So in the past, my view has been that we ought to view debates in the metaphysics of race as stemming from a metalinguistic normative dispute. Even if there are semantic facts of the right sort, I argued it's hard to see why they should trump other considerations in considering the practice questions. One set of considerations that is relevant here is obviously moral. There's a nice recent paper by Daniel Wodak arguing this, but I think the relevant considerations are quite broad and include not only semantic and moral, but epistemic, aesthetic, and practical questions. And because given different projects, different ends seem warranted, we can relativize such considerations to such projects. So we can ask what race concept is best for social science, or what concept of race is best for social justice. These questions look to involve consequentialist analysis. Now, there's a kind of epistemic worry here, which is that it's difficult to believe that outside of a narrow specific context, anyone has any idea about what the best concept is. For example, do the benefits of using racial terms and concepts in social science outweigh the costs that such uses impose by way of legitimizing racism? Or do the benefits of eliminating race talk from public discourse outweigh the costs that such a policy would impose upon those claiming racial identities? So if you just think about what it would be like to do a kind of cost-benefit analysis of questions like that, I think it's very hard to believe that we really have a good grip on what it would be to weigh all the costs and benefits. In the metaphysics of race, there is some emerging consensus around some kind of context-sensitive pluralism about the semantics of racial terms and about the metaphysics of what race talk picks out in those contexts. And I think maybe it's in part a result, this limiting to context is in part maybe a result of the thought that the big question itself is not itself answerable, that someone could perhaps promote an anti-realist stance in relation to personal identification and a social constructionist stance in relation to rectificatory justice. This is Chike Jeffers kind of making this point about localizing to a particular context. So here's a kind of read of what's going on. Insofar as metaphysicians of race already accept a broad consensus over the non-verbal, non-conceptual fact, and already accept there are different things one can reasonably take race to mean in various contexts, we can already see persisting first-order discussion about what race is as itself a part of a kind of meta-linguistic debate or negotiation over how we can or should use race to thought and talk. You could see such debate as a way of saying, look at these important things, whether they're biological populations or social scientific generalizations. Look at these important things that race talk can kind of respect or pick out. Okay, I want to just close by considering an alternative to both the semantic method and the engineering method based in kind of the politics of race talk. Now, many seem to acknowledge the need for a context-sensitive metaphysical and practical pluralism regarding what's picked out by race talk. But whether we're monists or pluralists, if what I've said is right, many already endorse a kind of ameliorative turn whereby we're free to revise and devise race talk as called for by the circumstances. So one kind of question is like, is this ameliorative turn the right move? Is it going to solve our problem? So the kind of argument in ameliorative or engineering arguments is one of fit to ends. Given what we want from race talk, how should we use it? What should it pick out? Sally Haslinger famously said that we are looking to seek what legitimate purposes we might have in categorizing people on the basis of such categories and develop concepts that would help us achieve these ends. Elizabeth Barnes says the basic idea behind the ameliorative project is this: when we're asking what social kinds like race and gender are, we should at least in part be asking what we want them to be, why and how these categories are useful. So what if there was a different solution to this fit to ends, a kind of political solution? Now, some philosophers have suggested that in actual cases of referential uncertainty, politics plays an essential role in determining what it is that we refer to. That is, if we go back and do history of philosophy or history of science, we find politics playing a role in how questions of referential indeterminacy get settled. Now, this can sound, when we talk about politics, just like the ameliorative project, but I think there's a different way of seeing the role of politics here, which is that of simply establishing a convention or institution. And what I want to suggest is that politics could play an essential role in resolving debates over race if they result in a convention or institution of dominant meaning. Now, by a dominant meaning, I just need to point out that sometimes there is a dominant meaning for a term, and those who don't use the term in that way are behaving badly. Someone puts on a conference and asks me to give a talk, and I show up at the conference and I say, I don't have anything to say, but I did bring a talk, and I produce a duck and I hand the duck to the person putting on the conference. There's a way in which I've used the term talk wrongly. That is, I'm behaving badly. I'm at odds with the conventional understanding of that term, and in some sense, I was responsible for doing so. While the folk theory of race may once have offered a dominant meaning, I don't think that any of the various philosophical theories of race talk are currently dominant in the way the word talk, meaning the kind of thing I'm doing now, is dominant. And so that using a word otherwise would be behaving badly. However, if one of the theories of race became dominant, then there would be a conventional argument that those who didn't respect the convention were behaving badly. If I'm right that the metaphysics of race is a verbal disagreement, then so far as respecting the facts, as opposed to the various normative considerations, we could just choose a practice. Such a choice would eliminate the need to police misleading implicatures. That is, a political choice will still have misleading implicatures, just like a semantic solution would, but all the leading candidates are likely to produce misleading implicatures. But it does suggest a different sort of resolution of a meta-linguistic dispute than those that are currently on offer. A political choice, a kind of semantic decision, if you will, among choices that are equal or incommensurable, perhaps. If these processes result in a dominant meaning, it could attain a kind of normative force in virtue of the communicative function of language. And such a norm wouldn't emerge from satisfaction of context-sensitive aims. It would be rather a revision that might lack a rational basis, except, as it were, a contrastive rational basis that made it more rational than the alternative, but nonetheless could be dominant. So just in conclusion, I've tried to point out that debate over the metaphysics of race is largely a verbal dispute, something I've argued before. The recognition of this dispute suggests first order metaphysics might be best appreciated as a metalinguistic debate already. Semantics seems to me unpromising, but in any case, it won't save us from endless bookkeeping. Engineering solutions may be possible, though they look to be really hard to evaluate. Political solutions offer a distinct promise of resolution, not one based in better fit with truth or satisfaction of specific goals. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Ron. So we're using the chat function. Please put in a Q in the chat if you have a question, and F if you have a follow-up finger. And I see Dawn on the queue already. So Dawn, please take it away.
Thanks, Ron. That was a really very, very nice survey. I mean, you painted the landscape with great clarity for me. On the suggestion at the end, so the real meat of the matter, I guess now, the suggested handing over of this or packaging of this as a political issue. I guess it would seem to me that the next step in that project is to then actually try to do an assessment of what the political consequences of making this a political, of treating this as a political issue would be, right? And because obviously then the debate, the political debate would itself be a political debate. The parties in the political debate would promote their various positions on the basis of trying to assess what the consequences for their side would be, like in all political debates. So assessing the proposal is immediately consequentialist, right? We'd have to actually start tracing out how would it actually go. I mean, and obviously then the risk of accepting your proposal is we might decide we'd be handing significant advantages or tactical weapons to racists, or maybe to other people who we also might not be strictly speaking racist, but have other agendas that we don't like. Have you started to work on that kind? Do you see that as the next step? Is that what you plan to do?
I think, here's what I think is, here's a different way of looking at your question. What if we thought of this as a political question, what would we do other than what we're already doing, which is to argue about various policies of race talk and, and their advantages and disadvantages. And that seems to me like an important point to make. And so in a way, the point about politics, so in a certain way, I'm not worried about handing more power to racists. I think in some sense, we're already engaged in this as a political project. And I think in a way, the point about politics at an end could be seen as a point about the method. You could view metaphysicians as not metaphysicians of race anyway, as not understanding what it is that they're doing. And what they're doing, it seems to me, is they're trying to, either within a context or at large, they're trying to produce a dominant meaning. You might think, right, if you're a bioethicist and you work on medical context, you're trying to produce a dominant meaning of race in a medical context, such that that'll be the right answer. And if maybe you think there's a general answer, no one should talk about race, you try to produce a dominant meaning so that everyone talks that way. So I think that's in a way what people are already doing, but it's not what they say that they're doing. And so there's a kind of way in which you could view it as a kind of methodological reading. And the reason it's not what they say they're doing and what they think they're doing is there's a way in which there's so much agreement. I mean, there's this view, there's this book, Four Views of Race, which is a terrific book about the metaphysics of race. But I find it a little bit, I actually think it's kind of should be called Four Views about Race Talk, because there's very little disagreement about like anything in the world in it. There's probably a little bit, but there's very little. And so it's kind of, you could see my view about politics as really a methodological reading of what it is the goal goal state is, what would make this problem, resolve this problem?
Great. We have Francesco Guala is next in the queue.
Yeah, thanks. I also found the talk very stimulating, and the main reason is that it resonates with some discussions that have been taking place in the philosophy of science, especially the role of values in science, since the resurrection of the inductive risk argument by Heather Douglas and others. I mean, the analogy, is that according to the inductive risk argument, scientists have to be transparent about the sort of values that play a role in the acceptance of theories. And in particular, when you accept a hypothesis or a theory, you are facing certain kinds of mistakes that are at least possible, and then you have to weigh sort of the costs and benefits, and some kind of values must play a role in the decision. But then, the discussion in that context seems to, take for granted that in the end, we are in a democracy, and, when scientists make decisions of this kind, they have to be transparent. But then, there's a policymaker which has, hopefully been democratically elected. And in a sense, all the debate, the political debate is kind of already over. I mean, the responsibility is of the policymaker to decide, whether the costs and benefits of building a dam or I don't know, a nuclear plant, what they are and how we should value, and this should reflect presumably, what the people, the electorate, the voters have already said. But in your case, I mean, in the cases that you're discussing, I mean, we're facing a situation when there isn't a consensus, right? So that's the problem. And I must confess that my ultimate reaction in a case like this is to say, well, then maybe our job, I mean, as academics or philosophers or scientists is just to again, we can be transparent about, what sort of values are at play, but we shouldn't really get engaged in this fight, because it is a political fight, really. And, maybe we should emphasize sort of the epistemic advantages or disadvantages, what kind of values are involved. But then, unless we become political activists, it's not really our job, to advocate one or the other solution. And but I know that a lot of people here disagree about that. So I wanted to know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think different academics see their jobs in different ways. I do think that, and that's appropriate to different persons and projects and so on. But I do think that even if we view ourselves sort of as cool epistemic philosophers of science and getting involved in all that hard to resolve political and ethical stuff, that there's a point to be made here, which is first of all, that these views which seem so different actually do seem to share this broad range of disagreement, this broad range of agreement, and they all seem to recognize this. And that what they seem to, at first order, even when they move into ethics, seem to be arguing over is itself probably an unresolvable set of issues, at least outside of very local context. It may be that there's a right answer about whether emergency room physicians should use racial classification, but I doubt there's a right answer about whether racial classification should ever be used or should never be used writ large in as it were European American culture. So I do think that, anyway, I think there are points to be made that you can make without wading into contentious and the contentious quicksand of morality and politics.
Good. We have Francesco Fronda is next.
Thank you. So I have a question about the argument for the thesis that these are merely verbal disputes. And correct me if I'm wrong, but part of the reason why you hold that is that these differences between metaphysical views are actually thin. So there's like you were saying, there's a lot of agreement about the fact that races have no essences in the way in which they have been traditionally characterized. But that seems to me only an argument in favor of seeing the views as metaphysically, with a few metaphysical differences, but that doesn't mean it is a verbal dispute. So it is about our terms that we're not agreeing on our terms. Just what it means is just that the differences are minimal, but that's not enough to say that it's merely a verbal dispute.
What would you take to be an example of a genuine dispute?
So, I mean, they seem to me a genuine dispute. For example, those who claim that races are socially constructed and those who take to be as natural populations, that seems to me a different in metaphysical characterization of what races are, even if they agree on the fact that there's no essences that they share.
Right. What I claim is that they have further agreement, right? I claim that there's further agreement that we can look at, the history of the human species and see population groupings and engage in them. And that moreover, we can look at the social structures surrounding race and see that the practices of classification that are both formal and informal, that have had various causal consequences for various people and may constitute in various ways their identities. I claim, though, that there's all this agreement about these metaphysical facts. And so once there's all that agreement, it really just looks to me like that the constructionists want to say, oh, this is what race is. And the population naturalists say, no, this is what race is. But they're, as it were, looking at the same world and, as it were, just taking the concept and applying it to different components of a shared reality, a shared conception of reality.
Okay, yeah, that helps. Thank you.
All right, Jonathan Knowles, you're next.
Yes, hello. I had a sort of couple of questions, but the first one was very similar to the last but one speaker, who the feeling I got having heard your talk was that in the end, although the philosopher was able to do a lot of ground clearing work and sort of clarify the debate in certain ways, there was ultimately nothing of a positive nature that the philosopher could actually provide that wasn't of a political nature. I mean, the philosopher might, of course, take part in the political debate, but ultimately these issues were going to be of a political nature, and that made me worry that, well, it made me think that there could be a kind of a way as a kind of dilemma. Either we end up in that sort of situation, or we have to find some way of understanding how these debates are not merely verbal debates. And then the other question I had was, I mean, many people think metaphysical debates are, in general, more like verbal debates. So, I mean, is it just a matter of keeping faith or seeing how things pan out, hoping that there might be something there in these sorts of questions that we'll be able to wring out through enough sort of discussion and assessment of the relevant theories and so on. But it doesn't seem to me there's any kind of like happy middle point between those two sorts of outcomes. Either you're going to have to sort of lump for some sort of, but there really isn't much for a philosopher to say about this question beyond the ground clearing stuff that you did, or we're going to have to sort of hold out some sort of hope for a classical sort of metaphysical approach where we just sort of stick at it. Yeah, that was my thought.
Thank you. So I would say a couple of things. One is that I know there are people who think most philosophical debates are verbal debates, and I'll remain silent about that question. In the case of the philosophy of race, it seems to me like there is something quite creative and interesting that happened in the last 30 years, which was that constructionist realist positions became articulated. Probably they grew out of sociologists and cultural theorists, people like Stuart Hall in the UK, for example. But the idea that you could say simultaneously that race is real, but it's a social thing, that seems to me like an interesting and like kind of as it were, a creative articulation of a position that I think at first it was sort of maybe hard to take seriously, but has it come to seem increasingly plausible to people. Anyway, I don't want to. I don't have the pessimism about philosophy that you do, except on Thursdays I become very pessimistic. But the rest of the week I'm very, very more optimistic than that. But I do think in this case there is an example, at least, of something that ought to make us see a kind of quite creative role that's as a bit more than ground clearing anyway, that theorists can be playing.
So there was a finger from Raphael Kunstler on, I think this was on Francesco Fronda's question, that apologies, Raphael, I didn't notice until I'd already called on Jonathan, but Raphael, why don't you take your finger now?
Thank you. Thank you, Ron, for your talk. It was very, very helpful. So yeah, I had a follow-up. So my question was, so if you said that there are not so much differences between different metaphysics, and then the dispute is merely verbal, and that's different views are only looking at a different part of the same reality. So then I was wondering whether there is not still a place for metaphysical work in the way of as Guala and Hendricks did with the with institutions, that is to try to describe this reality, and in a way it's what you just said with the Stuart Hall metaphysics, so that there is still work for metaphysicians that is independent of politics. It's just to try to give this broad picture and to explain how from this broad picture of reality different ways of looking at it could emerge.
I think that's right. I mean, I think philosophers, it's fun to hear philosophers talk about what they're doing, but of course there's lots of different things that they're doing. I tend to be a like, how does everything hang together with everything else kind of philosopher. Many people are, in metaphysics especially, are interested on essentially in questions of fundamentality, which also seem really interesting, but in some sense of a bit different character. It's vertical instead of horizontal, perhaps. But that what you said seems to me to be correct.
Okay, good. We have one more question on the queue from Douglas Porpora.
Yeah, thank you. I very much enjoyed the talk. My question is, how you imagine this dispute arising other than among philosophers? What I mean is, social scientists, we talk about race all the time. We, as you say, we might say, in the United States, the Black population voted for Biden, the white not. It really cuts racial lines. If you ask us, and you say, well, do you believe in race? I say, well, we don't believe that we believe that the country is racially divided along this category. Similarly, in our politics, we know the Republican Party in the United States right now is trying to roll back voting rights along racial lines, but nobody says, well, let's stop and ask whether race exists. So I guess my question is, what kind of context is it that would lead to this kind of a metaphysical question? Or is there a practical consequence, or is it among metaphysicians? That's what I'm asking.
Well, I take it some people do have practical projects. The most obvious way of making the point might be there are people who think we should never use race talk for any reason, because doing so, as it were, gives credence to racial generalizations and racial support. I mean, I think one thing that philosophers do, I mean, I've thought about this quite a bit because I run an interdisciplinary program, but you know, scientists, they have a job which is usually producing data, interesting data, and that's an important job, and that's not what philosophers are doing. And I think one of the things, though, is that they tend to, because they get, even people who are very good at producing interesting data, I think often they don't need to think hard about the conceptual questions, like what does it mean when political scientists report using racial concepts? You know, and what does it mean that different social scientific measures like self-report or other report of racial identities are used, right? And are those the same, and to what extent do they overlap? To what extent does that, what the social scientists who work on political behavior of racial and ethnic groups in the US, what is that vocabulary the same as emergency room doctors who are wondering whether they can use racial vocabularies in making quick classifications and assigning treatments to patients? Those seem important questions, and they're not quite social scientific questions in the sense that you don't need to answer them to be a good social scientist and produce interesting and important social scientific data, but they nonetheless seem worth addressing. And so these kinds of debates, beyond big blanket proposals like let's stop talking about race, it seems to me there's a lot of smaller questions that emerge in this same space that are worth answering, that people wonder about. If an emergency room doctor said, of course I can classify by race because it's obvious that race exists because they have different voting patterns, would that be a good argument, or would it not be a good argument? You know, these are questions that seem important and people care about.
There's no more questions in the chat queue, but I see Harold Kincaid has his hand raised. I'm not sure. It's I think 5 minutes before the end of session. Do we have time?
A short question.
Go for it.
Okay. Thanks, Ron. As you know, I've been sort of a fan of your work on race for quite a while. I have an article like 3 or 4 years ago, quite long article on race, where what I argue is that one way to approach it is to take it sort of in an Aquinian way and to ask, does our best social science commit us to a notion of race? That the answer to that probably depends on what context where you're talking about, and that you can talk about races as types of individuals, or you can talk about races like ethnic groups with cohesion, etc. And probably in the US and South Africa, there are races. So I can't quite tell. I mean, we're in the same camp in general, so I can't quite tell whether that would be sympathetic to what you're saying or not.
Yeah, so I tend to think two things. On the one hand, I tend to think it's good and useful to talk about race and the reality of constructed race because it's so useful in the social sciences. So I have that view, and it really, in a way, that's a kind of core view in my book about constructed kinds, is that could be useful in the social sciences, and we can talk about them. And then on the other hand, I have this verbal disagreement view, which is that in principle, all that vocabulary is eliminable. If you really felt strongly and wanted to talk about racial classification and racialization, I think that project, you could carry out that project. Of course, it would be a lot of work and tedious, but I think in principle, sort of, there's nothing to prevent someone from carrying out that project. and eliminating racial terminology from,
Okay, let's take a 3-minute break and we'll resume for the next session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. A round of applause for Ron. Thank you. Okay, welcome back for our second session of the afternoon. We're gonna sort of fix the order of the program now. We have Michael Rossetti speaking on how to build a robust ontology for the social sciences.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I owe big apologies for everybody, and especially Raphael, because I had problem to write down the good dates of this colloquium on my agenda, and I was not ready at 2, but I will try to do something now, but it will be freestyle for a part. But I'm very happy to talk with you about what I try to do on this topic of social ontologies. Maybe I could share a slideshow if it's possible, a PowerPoint. Sorry. I think you can see now the slides. I have to say that first of all, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a social scientist, a sociologist. My friend Alison White told me that I am a dust bowl sociologist, meaning that very empirical oriented. So this is a work, a theoretical work, but from a person who's not specialist of theory and also not in a philosophy of social sciences. I wrote a book about which I discussed much with Raphael, and I thank him very much for that. And this book we've published in French in April. The title is Social Matter, outline for an ontology, for robust ontology for social sciences. But I began to work on another version of the book in English, and more general maybe, and less embedded in the French debates within the sociological field about that. Well, I tried to put in English the main slides I need, but sometimes there will be some words in French, and I apologize for that, of course. When you are a sociologist in France, and I suppose also in other countries, the problem is to choose between a lot of terms, but a lot of concepts about social realities that seems to be very close. For example, to designate a person, ordinary person, you have to choose between several designated terms involving theories of action, theories of the social structure, and so on. So it's a good thing because it allows us to explore a lot of problems and themes of research, but it's also an issue because we have more and more difficulties to communicate between people involved in different intellectual framework. And so my idea was to try to build a more basic ontology for social sciences, trying to find very simple terms which try to catch the common sense of more sophisticated concepts. So these are the main ideas of this work, and these ideas I want to discuss with you. The first idea is to seek for robustness. So my ambition is not to create a new, very original, very revolutionary language or framework, but instead to try to find more common, more basic concepts that